This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoy this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. And be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and you can pitch future Critical Thought topics. Alright everybody, we got a good Critical Thought for you today. Before we get going, I decided I'm going to put a little deadline for the 1000 Let's Play vote. So I'm going to give it until next Sunday. That will be January 22nd, 2017. And at that point, we'll tally things up, and hopefully we'll be able to get to it, as I still need to start the Bastion play. Once again, your choices are between a play of the games from Zachtronics, some of the grand strategy games from Paradox, or a play of one of the massive RPGs from Bethesda, Skyrim, Fallout, stuff like that. Leave a comment on any of the critical thoughts, and like I said, in Sunday or after Sunday the 22nd, we'll tally things up and see where we're at. For today's critical thought, we're going to be talking about a very simple topic: jumping. The jump mechanics have been around since the video game industry was revived, and probably even earlier than that if we consider, or if we talk about games like Pitfall. And I know for those of you watching this, it doesn't sound that big of a deal or that complicated. Push a button, the character jumps. But one of the things that I love with these critical thoughts is be able to expand on these topics, and the fact that there's a lot under the surface and ways to elevate or change things. It's a lot like a hamburger. A hamburger is probably not the most complicated thing for a chef to make, but there is a big difference between a one-star, very disgusting burger you get at a poor diner versus a 5-star gourmet burger from either a professional food truck or a very fancy and probably expensive steakhouse. And the same can be said of jump mechanics. Now, when it comes to jumping, the first thing we have to talk about is essentially the great debate or the great divide of mechanics. It has to do with what I used to call committed jumping, but I think we're just going to short that to lock jumping versus free jumping. A lock jump is when the character essentially is locked into the jump animation from whenever they get into the air until they land. What that means is you cannot control the character's velocity once they're in the air. And this presents some very interesting challenges. And there are quite a number of games that have made use of this, especially in the old days. Stuff like Flashback, Out of This World, even the original Mario could be, in some sense, about a locked jump. Now, and of course, the big one, Ghosts and Goblins. Now, the example that I have here, there we go, is from Curse Castellet. I think I pretty much butchered that, and I apologize, which is a modern attempt at recreating the old Ghosts and Goblins feel. Now, when it comes to locked jumping, the challenge is the fact that it really turns the platforming into more of a puzzle than it does a traditional action game. Because I know that, let's say that I have a fixed length that I can jump at all times. And what that means is if I'm trying to jump between moving platforms, and I know that I can only jump to one specific point, it becomes a balance of how do I manage the jump, the position of the platforms, and of course all those lovely enemies flying around that are going to probably knock me off to my death. And again, when it comes to fixed platforming, the challenge is the fact that without being able to control your velocity, it basically means you are committed to the jump. And you almost pretty much know completely that the second you make that leap, whether or not you timed it or just judged it right. And while it did lead to some very challenging games, it can also be very frustrating. And that's why most games go with the free jump. That is, the second I'm in the air, I have complete control over where my character can go and move. It's unrealistic, yes, but it is a whole lot easier. And again, we have examples like Shovel Knight, and basically, again, you can close your eyes on a list of platformers, pick one, and it's probably a free jump. And This is where more of the action elements come into play when it comes to the platforming genre and jump mechanics in general. Because you're free to make these micro adjustments, it becomes about basically maneuvering your way through the air to get around obstacles, enemies, stuff like that. A really big example of just what you can do with a free jump would be the game Super Meat Boy. And Super Meat Boy is a very challenging platformer. You're not only controlling your character in the air, but you also have to control their running speed, which affects their momentum, which then will give you a little bit more in terms of maneuverability in the air. And we haven't even started to talk about supplemental mechanics that can be tied to jumping, and we'll get to that in the next few seconds. Free jumping is traditionally seen in just about any kind of action-based title, and again, this is where jumping becomes more about action than it is about platforming. But, action more than puzzle. There we go. But when it comes to jump mechanics in general, what we really have seen over the last 20 plus years are developers adding all kinds of new mechanics and things to supplement the ability to jump. And again, here comes the list, boys and girls. Double jumping, triple jumping, spin jumping, crouch jumping, jump while hanging, a dash to jump, rolling a jump, wall jumping, spin jump into a triple jump into a spin jump into a wall jump into the ground pound attack from Super Mario Galaxy. And there are probably even more than that out there. I'm pretty much sure there are. And before I completely forget, with our example Shovel Knight, we have the pogo jump, which was also seen in DuckTales. And all these elements come together to allow developers to have a very wide berth in terms of the simple jump. Now, a few days ago, I talked about control design, or the feel of the controller, or the feel of the control scheme in the player's hands. And another part of that, specifically relating to jumping, is again that kind of delay with animations. As we talked about, there's a big difference between pressing a button and having the character immediately jump up versus pressing the button, the character does like a little, crouch and jump. That almost like a millisecond of animation can mean all the difference in the world when you are trying to, again, extrapolate and figure out when's the best time to jump. And when you're trying to make micro adjustments in the air, it becomes all the more difficult. If you're going to do something with like that kind of animation, it's usually better when you're doing a lock jump system, because it sort of will feed into the fact that once you're jumping, you are committed to it. If you look at games like Aldous World and Flashback, again, the character doesn't immediately jump. He does like this whole like crouch, bend his knees, get right, and then he leaps. And once again, we're talking about animations in the milliseconds here, but even milliseconds can have huge impacts. Now, the other part of the jump mechanic also has to do with how it will feed into level, enemy, and environment design. And depending upon how you want to design and build your game up, how your jump will factor in can have a huge impact on your game's difficulty. Many classic games make enemies explicitly about the same size as the player's max jump height. And what that means is you either cannot leap over these enemies, so if they, box you in a corner, you're going to take damage, or you have to make almost pixel perfect jumping to get over them and avoid the enemy's hurt box. For easier games, they tend to do something like this. So let's say that my hand here is the jump height, and then the enemy's actual size may be about half. There we go. So that way, even if I'm jumping and it's going to be easier to dodge, I still need to prepare for it, or I may just land on the enemy and get hit anyway. Now, when it comes to the greater design of your levels, a important rule, and this is what we also see in the Metroidvania genre, is the fact that for every new mechanic or element you add to the character's jump or movement, that has to be extrapolated into the level and environment design. Here's a good example of this. Let's say we start a game and I have a single jump. So let's say this is my max height, or my max width that I can jump. What that means is platforms, in terms of their spacing, have to either be right on the point of that, or less, or I won't be able to make those leaps. But then let's say we unlock a double jump. So there, now my jump is this wide. What that of course means is from that point forward, I should be seeing platforms spaced further away. And of course we can throw additional mechanics in there, such as jump and then wait before you do the double jump to give yourself a little bit more momentum. And again, we're not going to be covering everything here in just one critical thought. And a really good example of this would be seen in the best Metroidvania titles. And for those of you who have been watching these videos, have we discussed Metroidvania in depth yet? Because if we haven't, that definitely needs to go on the list of topics. But in the Metroidvania genre, some of the best ones, what they do is the level design will evolve and change depending upon where the player is at in the title. So when you're starting the game out and you have maybe just a single jump, can't do any kind of dashing, stuff like that, the levels will reflect that. Platforms will be closer together, the actual jumps may be easier to do, there won't be any pits or spikes, stuff like that. And then when we get later in, let's say the player has a double jump, they can do a dash in the air, they can maybe do a teleport, all that other fancy stuff. The level design will reflect that. There'll be more death traps. Platforms will be spaced apart. Maybe they'll introduce, crumbling platforms. I mean, hell, we could even spend an entire critical thought talking about just like platform design, really. It's just that big of a topic. But coming back to the actual jump mechanic, jumping, just like with any element of game design, is going to be part of your core feedback loop. And what that means is once you've settled on how you want the player to jump and essentially the statistics or the variables around that, the entire game has to be a balance around that. If you decide to give the player, let's say, a triple jump and you don't compensate the game, the levels will essentially be broken. Or if you accidentally make the platforms too wide or introduce elements that the player doesn't have access to, then the game will be almost unbeatable for them. But we're going to wrap things up for today. To summarize, when it comes to jump mechanics, again, the amount of variety that you have gives developers a huge license to do just about whatever they want in terms of challenging the player, whether platforming will become a major action element, major puzzle element, or it could be just something very simple. You could have a game where when the character jumps, they kind of like float up in the air and like glide down, basically guaranteeing that the platforming will be meant for younger audiences or lesser skilled players. You could go the opposite and design pixel-specific platforms and spikes that you need to get exactly right or your character will die. Again, you can look at Super Meat Boy as the perfect example of that, especially when you get to the later levels or the bonus world and player create levels that are added to that game. But again, once you've settled on the jumping mechanic for your game, that will infer on all aspects of your title, from progression, level design, enemy design, and so on. And when you have games where you're going to give the player additional mechanics or additional functionality, again, the game has to be altered to compensate. When we just talking about Metroidvania, for instance, one of the more clever things designers love to do is have areas in earlier levels that you cannot get to without a later skill and kind of tease that to the player. You've seen this in so many Metroidvania examples. The platform that's just slightly higher than your max reach, or a section that no matter what you do, you just can't reach it just yet. And then you realize few hours down the line, oh, I just unlocked a dash move or a double jump, let me go back there and see what that's all about. You just have to be careful blocking or getting too much progression around that, but again, that's going to be too big for today's talk. For those of you watching this, what do you think about platform design, especially when it comes to locked versus free jumping? For those of you who have played modern platformers, chances are you've stuck with free-based jumping. I'm kind of curious if you play a game like Curse Castellea, or even went back as far as games like Flashback and Out of This World, what do you think about that kind of jumping system? Again, we could easily dedicate an entire critical thought to a game like Shovel Knight or Odalis's Dark Call, which was heavily based on classic design, but elevated things with modern or new touches. And for you designers out there, what kind of challenges or interesting things did you run into if you decide to build a platformer, whether it is 2D or 3D? And that, my friends, is probably another topic as well, because we've just been sticking with 2D, and there's a completely different learning curve and philosophy when we talk about 3D design. But that'll have to be for another day. So as always, thank you so much for watching these videos. I hope you enjoyed everything. Be sure to like and subscribe if you did. Once again, I'm Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Be sure to check back tomorrow for more great content here and on Game Wisdom. Have a good night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.